Hey everybody, just a note before we start the video. Everyone that was playing these chess games were being punched in the face in front of a huge crowd. There's a lot of pressure going on. So all of this analysis is mainly just to educate people that might want to get into the game of chess and were interested by the event. So that's all. Let's get into the video, and I hope you all enjoy the analysis that was done here. Okay, now in game 1, we have Boxbox versus Stanz. Boxbox is playing with the white pieces here and opens with the move e4. Stanz replies with the move e6, which is the French defense. We see knight c3, and then d5 and d4. And this is actually a very popular opening. This is the French defense, and this is just by transposition. So actually a way we can get to this is by playing d4 first, and then knight c3, which is a very, very popular way to play against the French defense. After the move knight to c3, d5, d4, we see knight f6. And this is the Steinitz variation of the French. So this is actually a very theoretical line played by masters. We see e5, knight f to d7 now. And here we see the first offbeat move, which is knight g to e2. Generally, in these types of positions, what we can see is there's an imbalance of space in the center. White has a little bit more space, but black intends to use that to their advantage as well by trying to break it down and prove that white is what we call overextending themselves, with moves like c5 trying to target this d4 pawn. Now, knight ge2, the reason why it's a little offbeat is because it doesn't aim to defend e5. Generally here, what we see is f4 or knight to f3, and both moves defend the e5 square, preparing to see c5 and c takes d4. For example, if we see f4 here, and then c5, knight f3, and let's just assume black takes early on d4, the idea of behind f4 and also knight f3 is that now the e5 pawn is no longer weak. But in the game, knight ge2, there is still a chance after c5 to play the move f4, and this is a reasonable try. But instead, Boxbox makes a mistake here by playing the move g3. And the problem with g3 is now there's not actually a way to defend the e5 pawn, and the center for white will fall very quickly. So in this position, what can be played is c takes d4, where after queen takes d4, if knight takes d4, there's knight takes e5 immediately, winning the pawn. And if queen takes d4 instead, defending the pawn, unfortunately, the move knight c6 develops, attacking the queen and the pawn, and since there's two knights attacking e5 and there's only our queen defending it, even if we stay defending the pawn somehow, it can still be taken, unfortunately, because we cannot capture the knight, because we will lose our queen for their knight. So instead, knight c6 was played, missing this opportunity, and then bishop to g2 was played after that. And again, there are promising moves of taking on d4, and maybe what should have been played here is also f4, aiming to keep the e5 pawn alive. But bishop g2, and now we see queen to b6, adding even more pressure. This is very, very good play by black so far. After queen to b6, we see castles, and here's the first big mistake from black that isn't a mistake of not capitalizing. This makes their position worse, which is f6. And f6 has a funny way to be refuted. So h3 was played because finding this refutation is very difficult, but there's actually a really crazy move here, knight takes d5. And the idea of knight takes d5 is after e takes d5, we have the move e6, and what this does is it forces black to undevelop their pieces, where black's king is in the center, white's king has already castled, and white can get a pretty big lead in development with a move like knight f4, and this is actually worth a full piece. As we can count here, white has only one knight, black has two. We're actually down a full knight here. But it doesn't matter because black's king is so weak, it's not only worth that, but it's worth much more, and white would be winning in this position. Instead here, the move h3 was played, and now we see c takes d4, and now knight to a4. And the problem with knight to a4 is it actually can get a little stuck over here. Queen c7 was played as a response, and this is a very natural move, just because the queen generally goes here in French positions. But actually, the move queen a6 poses some serious problems. Where does this knight go? It actually can't move anywhere. And the only way to give it some squares is by playing b3. But the second we play b3 to defend the knight, then our center falls, and again, white would be losing here. So again, after queen a6, if c3 to defend the knight instead, which looks a little bit more like an active way to do so, now b5 happens, and again the knight cannot move, and this is a big problem, so this isn't something that white can get away with. So queen c7 was played in the game, and now we see e takes on f6 here, knight takes on f6, and now knight takes d4. And what black should do now is take on d4 and play bishop d6. And it's a game. It's still something that either side could easily win. But here, bishop d6 first was played, and there is a problem with this. What ended up being played in the game was bishop g5, but instead here, the move knight b5 causes some problems, because if this bishop were to be taken off the board and traded for one of the knights, the problem is, well, as we can see, the center for black is actually on light squares, and by taking their dark square bishop, we're forcing them to lose control over the dark squares. And with this type of structure and with no pawn on f7 here, we can argue that black's king might run into some danger. And after queen d8, this is actually true after either knight takes d6, trading the knight for the bishop, or the more active move, which is c4. And the idea is just to blow up the center. And this is a huge problem. Again, you can't actually take this pawn, because knight takes d6 would just win the bishop outright, because the queen cannot capture. Our queen is now attacking the bishop as well. This is a pin on this pawn. And right now we're also threatening to take on d5 and open the position where black is underdeveloped and their king is less safe than white's. So bishop g5 was played instead. This is also another easy thing to miss here. We see castles, bishop takes f6, and now g takes f6, and this is a very interesting reply. The idea here is to increase black's control over the center. With g takes f6, it does slightly weaken their king, but now e5 and g5 are covered by this f6 pawn. One thing that they have to worry about again is knight b5. This is continually one of the best moves, followed by c4 again. This is very strong, and again, there's really... It's really hard to deal with the initiative that white has by opening the position, where black's king is a little unsafe because there's no pawn coverage around that king. Instead, queen g4 check was played, and this is a problem. This originally might look like a good move because it's attacking the king, but there is a problem with it. After king to h8, we can actually argue this is what black wanted to do. In this position, with the king on g8, they kind of want to play king h8, because then it's off of this diagonal where c4 and bishop takes d5 potential issues were coming into play. And also, again, queen g4 check could be an annoying move at some point. So queen g4 check now is a little bit too early. And there's actually a thing we say in chess, which is the threat is stronger than the execution. So having the threat of queen g4 check is always nicer than just playing the move, because the execution is a little bit weaker than the threat of it. And after queen g4 check, king h8, black is a little bit happy about that, because now we can even see moves like rook g8 coming, as well as e5 being a potential threat, attacking the knight and the queen. There are defenses to that, but there's more complications already happening. In this position, we see knight takes e6, though, going for the knight. And now we see bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, and rook a to e8, attacking the queen. And here, if Boxbox were to take the pawn on d5, they would be in a winning position. The center has collapsed for black. The king is still weak, and, well, white is up material and has a safer king. This is going to be a win. The problem is rook fe1 was played. And the problem with this move is we're exchanging our queen for their rook. And generally what we have in chess is we have something we call like a material value, and we evaluate each piece by how many pawns it's worth. So a queen is worth 9 pawns of material, or 9 points of material. A pawn is, of course, worth 1. And a rook is worth 5. So when we play a move like rook e1 and offer this trade, what's happening is we're losing 9 points of material, and then we're gaining back 5. But that's a minus 4 points of material. And this isn't really something we want. And now, unfortunately, Boxbox is losing in this position, chess-wise. After this, knight to d4 is played, attacking the rook. Bishop takes d5. And then bishop takes g3, which is a very strong move. And the idea is just to go for the kingside attack. After f takes g3 and knight e2 check, the game ended up being decided through the boxing instead. Boxing. I'm not funny. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it ended up being decided in the boxing round instead, I believe. And that's how the game went. So there was some really interesting things. They had great openings, and there were some ideas that they had that looked very correct. There were some natural moves that they played, which ended up not being maybe the best. But of course, do remember they were in a ring around a lot of people and hitting each other. So there's a lot of pressure going on. It's natural to make lots of mistakes. And yeah, regardless, it was a really interesting game to see. Let's go on to the next game. Okay, and now we have round number 2, which is Chrisbroad versus Overtflow. Chris opens up with the move d4, which is the queen pawn opening, and then we see e6. And funnily enough, just like game 1, this is kind of an invitation in order to play the French defense. If we play the move e4 here, then after d5, this is actually just a French, and knight c3 would transpose into the previous round. Instead, what happened here is Chris played knight f3, and Overtflow made not really such an amazing move here, which is bishop b4 check. Why is bishop b4 check maybe not a great try? The problem is, it is natural in that it attacks the king, but there are some drawbacks to it, and that's the move c3. So instead, maybe a move like bishop e7 was a little bit better if we wanted to improve this piece, because after knight f3 and bishop to b4 check, the bishop starts getting kicked around, and the move c3 is something we're happy to see because it helps fortify the center, specifically the d4 pawn. And of course, the bishop now has to move. So bishop to a5 was played, and now b4, starting to kick the bishop even further. Chris goes on with bishop to f4, which is what we would call kind of like a London setup, actually, except with c3 and b4 included. Now we see knight to h6, e3, knight to a6, bishop to d3. So again, because white has a pretty good center here, it's harder for black to make natural moves, developing their pieces. Again, maybe a move like knight c6 would have been preferred. You always have to watch out for moves like e4 and d5, trying to kick that knight around too. But knight a6, bishop to d3, and now there's another mistake, and this one is a bit more clear as to why it is one. The move c5 was played. The problem with c5 here is that when c5 is played, unfortunately, we have 2 pawns defending that square. And when we take it, they can't really capture back, because if they do, well, then they would be losing a piece for a pawn in that situation. And when we talk about material values, a piece is worth 3 pawns, so losing one, in this case, not really for any compensation, it's not really worth it. Instead, a3 was played, and we're going to see that taking on c5 or taking on b4 were possible here several times, and black should be trading that pawn to avoid the loss of their own pawn, and white should be taking that pawn for a few moves here. So taking on c5 would be correct. And rook b8 is also a bit of a mistake. The problem with rook b8 here is that eventually we can take. I would argue we should just take now. The bishop is worth 3 points of material, and the rook is worth 5. Generally, because the rook has a very easy way to move. It can move along any file or rank, and it's a very powerful piece. So losing the exchange here, as we'd call it, isn't really something that we want to voluntarily do without getting something in return. And here we don't really get something in return, unfortunately. But this wasn't played. Knight bd2 was played instead, and this is also not such a bad move because it develops a piece. Queen to d8. Queen to c2 was played, and of course taking the rook would be the best option, but queen c2 was played instead. Rook to e8, and now we see bishop takes h7, winning the h7 pawn, and all of a sudden there's a kingside attack brewing. King to f8 was played. Arguably king h8 is a little bit better. It's a little bit safer being on the corner of the board here. When it's brought closer to the center of the board, there could be problems, and here there actually is. Bishop d6 check was played. And after rook e7, there's actually a really incredible move here found, and that's bishop g8. At first when I saw this, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this looks like a mistake because of course king takes or knight takes. But there are some difficulties here to solve. After king takes h8, the move knight g5 was played, and after knight to g5, there's a threat of checkmate, which is queen h7, queen h8, and then knight h7, queen takes g8, which of course is a lot to calculate, and you know, when there's a lot of nerves, this is easy to miss. C takes b4 was played, but instead, maybe black should have played g6, and the idea here is just to prevent, essentially, queen h7 from happening on the board, because this would just be mate. Instead, c takes b4, queen to h7 check, king to f8, and now queen to h8 check. Knight g8, and unfortunately Chris missed a mate in 2 here. With knight h7 check, king g8, and queen takes on g8. This would have been a really, really nice checkmate. Instead, the move bishop to e5 was played. And I think the idea was to potentially take on g7, but unfortunately, the move f6 could be played as a reply. And now, all of a sudden, g7 is defended by the rook, and it makes things a little bit more messy. Instead here, b takes a3 was played, and again, knight h7 check, followed by queen g8 would be mate. But Chris ends up playing queen takes g8, and unfortunately this just gives up the queen for the knight. And again, when we look at the queen, it's worth 9 points of material, the knight is worth 3. This is a heavy loss of material. After king takes on g8, we see knight d to f3, rook to a8, which saves the rook from being captured by the bishop. So this makes total sense. And now, since black is up the queen here, they should win if it's just a chess game. Of course, it wasn't just a chess game, was it? Knight to h4 was played. d5, e4, now a2, rook to e3. And this is interesting because they're trying to bring the rook over. Also, a3, a2 made some sense. The pawn is just hanging now. But naturally, what you want to do when you have a passed pawn is push it. Of course, here it can be taken, so you have to be careful when you do push your pawns. Rook to d7 was played. Rook to g3. And now f6, which wins material now, which is a very clever move. There is also an argument to be made about knight takes e6, but after queen to e8, attacking the knight, unfortunately, something is going to be lost here. It's so close to being something really, really special, but unfortunately, queen to e8 has to be found. Not queen e7, because maybe this would be a justification for white here. Now they can take and attack the king and the queen at the same time. And a position like this might happen. Or even taking on e5, actually. This also looks really good. And now bishop to f4 was played, but now the knight hangs. Overtflow didn't end up taking the knight. And I think there is a good reason why. They were a little scared of their queen being attacked here. Of course, being materially focused in chess, especially when you're newer to the game, is a very, very good way to end up winning it. Just because if you take all of your opponent's pieces off the board, it's harder to defend against checkmate, and also it's harder to get attacked. So, d takes e4, Knight to g6 was played, and now we see queen e8, and after rook h3, we finally see queen takes on g6. Bishop to e3. Knight to c5. Unfortunately, this knight, it's hard to save before. You should probably play knight takes e6, but there's also queen f5, and this could cause problems because now the bishop and the knight are hanging. Okay, but bishop to e3. Knight to c5 was played, and unfortunately this does hang the piece. So pawn takes the knight is possible. And unfortunately there is no trick here with rook d1, as the rook on a1 does defend that square. f3 was played instead. Knight to d3. Now knight takes e4. So finally Chris was able to save the knight. Rook to c7. Rook to c1. Which unfortunately is a huge mistake because now the knight can take the rook. Bishop takes c1, rook to d7, bishop to e3, bishop takes d4. This can be taken. One thing to note here is that in this position after taking, black should be promoting their pawn into a queen. This would, of course, give them 2 queens on the board and would make the job of winning a little bit easier. So as we can see, it's been possible here. And again, here, promoting is possible too. And it's still possible. And king g2, rook ac8, rook h4, queen to d3 was played. Again, promoting is always possible. Bishop h6, but queen takes d2. This is a mistake because it does give back the queen for the knight. But at the same time, although it might be a mistake when we look at it as losing material, when we look at what's remaining on the board, it might be a practically very good move. So the way you think about it depends. When I would see something like this, I would say, oh, this is not a mistake. This is just simplifying the position because now rook c2 comes, we can take the bishop, there's no way to defend it. This is actually what happens. And then, again, black can end up promoting here. We end up not seeing that still. g5, rook to c1, g takes f6, rook g1 check, king to f4, rook to f1, rook to h3, rook to e2, f takes g7, king takes on g7, rook g3 check, king f7, h3, rook takes f3, rook takes f3, rook e4 check, king g3, and then rook to f4 was played, which is a huge mistake. Again, the biggest problem here is that black was giving up material when they didn't have to. The first time when they gave up their queen, this was actually totally okay. But giving up this rook was unnecessary on f3 here. And after rook e4 check, rook f4 was also unnecessary. Instead, if we just move the king out of the way, black is still totally winning here. The pawn is going to be hard to stop from promoting. For example, after rook f1, we can just play rook e2, and actually the b pawn starts running. b4, b3, b2, and b1, and there's not really a way to stop it. This should be a win for black. Unfortunately for Overtflow here, Chrisbroad ended up winning, so that's how the game ended. All right, now let's get into round number 3. So this is Toph playing with the white pieces against Hugs. Let's get started. We see the move e4 from Toph, e6 from Hugs, d4, d5, and again, we have a French defense. In round 1, we have a direct transposition into round 1, the knight c3 French. And in round 2, there was an invitation to it, and again, we're seeing a French here. So instead here, d takes e4 was played, and d takes e4 is what we call the Rubinstein French, and the idea of taking on e4 with knight takes e4 is sure, white has some good pieces in the center, but black is trying to claim that they have some solidity with their position because there aren't really any weaknesses. And now we see a very high level move, which is the move knight d7. Why is this so high level? So the problem is knight to f6 immediately looks very tempting, but after knight takes f6, we don't really want to take with the queen here. After queen takes f6, we can immediately see that the queen isn't so happy because of a move like knight to f3, where already we're threatening a move like bishop g5, trying to kick the queen around, and the queen is going to have to move around to defend itself because the queen is more valuable than a bishop or a knight. So instead, knight to d7, the idea here is after what was played, bishop to d3, we can now play knight f6, and if a capture was played, knight takes f6, knight takes f6, the idea is that we can recapture with the knight instead of the queen, as developing the queen too early would be kind of a problem for Hugs here. Now we have the move queen to e2, which actually sets up an interesting trap. Knight takes e4 was played, bishop takes e4, and now we have a mistake from Hugs. Knight to f6. And Toph finds it very, very interestingly. Bishop takes b7 is a very, very strong move. And the idea is that this pawn is undefended. After bishop takes b7, queen b5 check actually just picks up the bishop. Knight to d7, queen takes b7, bishop to e7, and white goes on to develop with and is just happy with their extra pawn. And this is a pretty big pawn. Knight to f3, castles, castles, and knight to f6 was played. It ended up that Hugs won this one with the black pieces, I believe, in the boxing round. But this was a really, really cool game to see. So let's go on to the next round. And now we have it, the big event. Grandmaster Amon Hambleton versus International Master Lawrence Trent. Let's get into it. So Amon is playing with the white pieces here and opens up with the move d4. And those that know Amon is very well known for playing the London system, which is what happens here. Knight to f6 and bishop to f4. And we'll explain the arrows in just a moment. So let me remove those. But the idea here is with the London system, we call it a system opening because you can generally play the same moves over and over. We have to be very careful about using that type of language too, because of course, making the exact same moves, we have to worry about our opponent's threats still. But generally, what white can do here is play e3, c3, get this sort of triangle in the center, play knight f3, bishop e2, and knight d2. And it's very harmonious for white and can offer generally a slight advantage as well. Lawrence immediately throws out c5, and the idea behind the move c5 is, well, it looks like it's just losing a pawn, but that's not really the case. What's going to happen after d takes c5 is knight a6, and what's probably best and what white should do here is actually just give back the pawn on c5. Holding on to it is more of a nuisance than actually just giving it back. And what just happened is white just traded a center pawn for a flank pawn, and black can claim that this was an advantageous trade for them. So, of course, Amon does not go into that, instead goes e3, just to back up the center. Now we see the move knight d5, attacking the bishop on f4. And here we see a really funny-looking move. Bishop takes b8. And this looks a little counterintuitive because bishop takes b8, we are moving a piece twice to take a piece that has never moved. But the idea here is that we're just trying to avoid all tricks and traps with white here. So c3, and now we see e6. The idea is if takes, now we can take back on c5 with the bishop. Knight to d2, c takes d4, e takes d4, and now b5. And the idea here with the move b5 is just to prevent this move c4 trying to kick this knight from d5. So this knight is actually very, very strong here, and black can claim an edge in this position. Here we see knight g f3, bishop to e7, and now a4, and the idea behind a4 here is to actually try to undermine the structure. For example, if you end up taking on a4, now the move c4 comes, and we can see why b5 was so useful there, because, well, now the knight has to move off of its beautiful square. Instead, the move b4 was played, and this can cause some problems because now again c4 is a very strong move. Instead, in this position, taking on a4 was probably actually the best bet, because after taking on c4 or a4 and seeing c4, at least we have this b4 square for our piece. Instead, when we play b4, like in the game, after c4, there is no knight b4, and the knight is pretty active on the square. So the knight has to go back, knight to f6, and now it's arguably about equal. Bishop to d3, castles, castles, and here we see a5, just defending the b4 pawn. Now rook to e1, and as you can see, these guys are masters. They know what they're doing. They're improving every single piece. So what's one of the worst pieces, or what's a piece that's not really doing too much for white? The rook on f1, also the rook on a1. So what we're going to see is these pieces are going to come into the game in short order. Rook to e1, d6, queen to e2, just to connect the rooks. This is a normal developing scheme. Bishop to b7, and like I said, they are masters. They improve their pieces. What's the worst piece in this position? The rook on a1, rook ac1. Now we see the move bishop to a8. And the idea behind bishop to a8 is, well, it's just keeping it out of harm's way and also just making sure the rook is a little active. Now we see b3. Rook to e8 here. Now knight to e4, offering some trades in the center. h6 was played instead of knight takes e4. The problem with knight takes e4 is making all of these exchanges just gives white a very happy position. As we can see, white's queen is doing great. The knight is very active. This bishop can get a little active on f6, but generally it feels like black is more passive here than anything. So h6 was played, and now knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, and rook c to d1. So all of a sudden, yeah, the rook on c1 wasn't doing as much. Now the rook on d1, the idea could be we might see some sort of d5 or c5, and the rook is opposite the queen, so there might be potential tactics in the air. We see queen b6, and now bishop to e4, offering a trade of the light square bishops. d5. And the problem with d5 is now there's this move c5, which actually just ends up where white's in a winning position at this point. After queen c7, there's a really strong idea of bishop b1. g6, we have to avoid this specific idea of queen d3, queen h7, which could cause just immediate problems. But after the move g6, h4, we're going for it anyways. And we're trying to play h5 and loosen this structure on this side of the board. And if h5, what do we do? Well, let's just say g4 could be in the cards. Not immediately. Actually, one of the moves recommended here is rook d3, bishop c6, rook e3, improving the piece to the e3 square. And now what we're going to see is, let's just keep going through the moves here. Knight e5, for example, and now we're actually getting primed for g4. That's why this king h8, king g8 was played, just in case we need rook h8 on the board. And actually the top move here is rook h8, and that says a lot that this move is just aimed to defend against this g4 threat. So this is actually very, very, very good for white because black doesn't really have any activity and white's just making threats every move. So bishop d3 was played instead. And again, this actually is a winning position for white. Bishop c6, g3 was played, and now g6. And now it went into the boxing round right after this, and Amon ended up winning that one. I really, really recommend checking out that boxing round. It was very, very cool to see. But regardless, Amon was also winning on the board in this position as well, just because there are threats of h4, h5 in the position, and only white can really make threats here as well. So that's how this one ended. Let's go on to the next one. And now we have Andrea Botez versus Dina Belankaya. Let's check it out. Andrea is playing with the white pieces here and opens up with d4. And we see knight f6. And just like Amon, Andrea plays the London system. We see d6 here, and the idea instead of d6 instead of c5 is just to prepare a c5 or e5 break. Now we see e3 and h6 just to prevent any bishop g5 moves. Knight to f3, g5, bishop to g3, and bishop to g7. So the idea here is that black got to kick around this bishop a little bit, and of course does have a little bit of weaknesses potentially on the king side, but might end up going for an attack with some sort of knight movement and f5, trying to really go after this bishop on g3, which can sometimes feel misplaced. So bishop d3 was played, knight to h5, and now we see the move knight b to d2. Again, this is kind of like a normal London system development scheme where the piece goes to d2, this knight goes to f3, bishop on f4 or g3, and bishop on d3 or e2. Now we see knight c6 and c3, just to prevent any knight b4 problems, and also it just helps control more central space. e6, and now we see e4, trying to really increase the control in the center. Dina ends up playing the move knight to f4, where after bishop takes f4, g takes f4, Dina's idea was to kind of get a kingside attack, it looks like, with moves like bishop f6 and rook g8. Queen e2 was played as a response, and after queen e2, we see bishop to d7, which has the idea, I believe, of castling potentially long, just keeping options open. You can see that stronger players, they tend to try to keep flexibility in positions, and this is exactly what I mean, where black might end up castling long, or they might end up castling short. This position isn't really so great, unfortunately, for Dina, because castling long does take a little bit of time, and this pawn is pretty weak as well. There's a little bit more weaknesses in the position for black than for white, and in a normal classical game, it's most likely that, well, white would win this. But of course, this isn't a classical game. That's something to keep clear. So now we see the move a4, and e5 comes, trying to, or a5, my apologies, comes, where this is just aimed towards preventing any further pushes on the queen side. But now that this move was played, it's very unlikely that black is going to be castling long, because let's just say they end up doing that. Let's say h3 in this position, queen e7, and then castle short, and we see castles long. The problem is, this is more advantageous for white, despite the open file against our king, because b4 is something that can come very easily, and this just opens everything. This is a pawn, generally you don't want to move pawns too hastily or too often in front of your king, because you create something called a hook, like a fishing hook, where white can try to start attacking it with a move like b4 and force the opening of lines. Of course, instead what happened in the game was knight c4, queen to e7, queen to d2 here, and now d5. Now after d5, we see knight to a3, and this is just rerouting potentially to b5. D takes e4, bishop takes e4, and f5. And the cool thing about f5 is black's trying to go for e5, and if they're really lucky, they can go for e4. After bishop c2 and e5, funnily enough, it should be allowed. You just castle here, and the problem is, if you go e4, you can just sacrifice a piece with queen takes f4. And the idea is, after taking on f3, there's rook fe1, and the queen is actually very, very poorly placed, where we're going to at least win our piece back, probably even more than that, because there's just so many problems on this file with the queen and the king aligned like this. This is what we call, of course, an alignment problem, as you can guess. So after e5, we see the move d5 instead. And now e4 comes, and it's not as easy. We would love to castle, and yeah, taking on f3 would still be a mistake, because we can get a position like this with rook e1, and their queen is extremely weak, and we should actually end up winning that queen on e7. But now there's the move knight e5, and this center starts to show its strengths. After knight e5, we see knight to d4, and this is what I mean by the center's showing its strength. f3 was played. And this is a very strong move. The idea is we're just trying to, as black, open up the white king. All of a sudden, even though it was on an open file, the reason why it didn't matter as much is because, well, black's king was in the center, or black's king was generally weaker. Here, that's not really the case anymore, because rook g8 and moving the bishop is about to happen, and there is a direct attack on that king, and things are not going to end well. Here we see the move g3, and Dina ends up playing h5, knight a to b5 to get some activity, bishop to h6, attacking the queen, and just be aware that if we try taking on c7 with check, normally would be nice because we would be winning what we call an exchange again. But the problem is after king d8, our queen is attacked, so we can't really deal with that. We have to move our queen, and then we actually lose our knight entirely, which would be really unfortunate. So queen d1 was played. And yeah, this is actually winning for black now because, well, queen g5 comes, and it's really hard to stop queen g4, queen h3, and knight g4. This is coming in. There's not really a good way to stop it. Knight takes c7 was played, but it's already too late. You can actually win all the material you want as white, as long as queen g4, queen h3, and knight g4 comes. So now we see king f7, king h1, queen g4, d6, queen h3, bishop to b3 check, and again, Dina doesn't care, king g6, rook to g1. This is very important, that queen g2 was not possible yet with checkmate because black's king was attacked. So king g6 was played, rook to g1 now, knight to g4, and then knight takes f3 was played, and Dina had a chance to end things really quickly with knight takes f2 checkmate. But of course, you're getting punched in the face sometimes, like, and again, there's so much pressure in these matches, like, it's insane. So e takes f3 was played instead, which is totally winning as well. But I believe this is when the round went into a boxing round instead. Dina ended up holding off on that, and they went back to the chess around this point. Bishop f7 check was played, king h7, bishop g6 check, but after king takes g6, the checks run out, and now it's impossible to stop. Queen takes h2, queen g2, or knight takes f2 with checkmate. And that's how the game ended. Okay, now into the next round. We have Myth versus Cherdleys. Let's get started. We see e4 from Myth, d5 from Cherdleys, and this is what we call a Scandinavian defense. And here we see the move d3. And now Cherdleys makes a pretty big mistake. Here, what they should do is they should take on e4 and take on d1 here and argue, okay, white lost the right to castle, and they can just develop naturally, and it's an equal, maybe slightly better position for black. But bishop g4 was played instead. And the problem with this is queen takes g4 is possible, and this loses a full piece for nothing, unfortunately. And why this matters is because when we look at chess, we look at it as, well, what can we control in the center? What can we use to attack our opponents? And when we give up pieces without a reason, then we have less forces to organize to attack our opponent. And unfortunately, this would just end up in a losing position for black here. Myth doesn't play that move. Myth instead plays the move f3. Now we see knight to d7, and here, again, the bishop should move like bishop h5, or even bishop back to like c8 or something, just keeping the piece. But knight to d7 was played, offering the bishop again. Unfortunately, the bishop should be taken, and actually ends up being taken now. Here we see g5, and this isn't really the strongest move, to say the least, because, well, what we should do when we're playing chess and playing the opening is we should be developing our pieces and improving them, controlling the center, getting our king to safety. And the move g5 doesn't do that. Instead, moves like knight to f6, or even e6, preparing to move this bishop out and develop it, would be a lot more harmonious, just because, well, black can get their pieces out and start creating attacks. g5 doesn't do that. Knight c3 was played to attack the pawn, knight gf6, and Myth takes the pawn. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, and here we see the move h6. And after h6, Myth continues with development with knight f3. Very good play so far by Myth. Rook h7, which again doesn't really offer black any great chances here. Instead, playing moves like bishop g7, look at this diagonal. This bishop actually would be really, really nice here. And then they can follow up with moves like knight f6. Of course, they are down quite a bit of material, but you know, you got to develop your pieces, and that's how you create attacks and win the game. Rook h7 doesn't really do that. This rook on h7, it's unclear what it does on h7 that it doesn't do on h8. Bishop takes g5, h takes g5, so giving back a piece, which is unnecessary here, but it's actually totally fine as well. Like white is still winning, funnily enough, but now instead of being up a piece, they're not. Knight takes g5 was played, and this is a good move. a6, knight takes h7, missing the threat. The threat is white is threatening to take the piece, so they should move it. This is another problem with rook h7, is didn't really belong there. So a6 was played, knight takes h7, now we see b6, queen to f3, and after a5 we see the move queen to e4 here, and what ended up happening is Myth won the game. So that's how this one went. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, and now we have Pointcrow versus DisguisedToast. Pointcrow playing with the white pieces opens up with d4. We see d5 from Toast, knight to f3, knight to c6, knight to c3. So just developing all of the pieces. This is a great way to play. Bishop to f4, bishop to f5, e3, e6. So both sides are playing symmetrically here, but this is a very good way to develop the pieces. Bonus points to both sides, or just points to both sides. G3 was played, and G3 is a little unnecessary. And the reason I say that is because, well, this bishop actually already has a way it can develop. The idea behind G3 was to bring it to G2, but in doing so, we can see that this bishop becomes a little bit more clunky. It's hard to actually move it around because we're reducing the amount of squares it can go to. And it's a move that develops a piece that isn't really something we have to do because the bishop can already be developed on this diagonal. So G3 was played. But then b5 was played, and this is also a pretty big mistake. This undefends the knight, and also the pawn can be taken. Knight takes b5 was played, very strong move. Arguably, bishop takes b5 was stronger, and the reason why is because after a move like queen d7, knight to e5 comes. And this is a huge problem because we're just taking advantage of this huge pin. The knight can't move, the queen doesn't really want to move either. This knight's going to be lost, and probably the queen too. This would already be game over. So knight takes b5. And now we see a6, allowing knight takes c7 with check. And this is a pretty big deal, because what's going to happen is we're going to be winning the exchange as white. So knight takes c7, king d7, knight takes a8, and queen takes a8. So white is completely winning in this position. We see c3, knight to g4, knight to e5 check, king to e7, and knight takes on c6. Now there's another mistake, king to d7. This was unnecessary. This is a piece we can capture, and we should be happy to do so. But this didn't happen. Instead, king d7 was played. Knight to b8 check. Now king to c8 was played. And funnily enough, that knight on b8 can't really be taken anytime, like immediately, just because, well, it's actually defended by the bishop on f4, and we don't want to take it on b8. Queen to a4 was played. g5, and this is a very, very cool move because g5 tries to force this bishop to move in order to win this knight. This is actually a very, very strong move. The problem is there's queen d7 checkmate. This was not found. Queen d8 check was played instead. King b7. And now we see long castles, which also maybe not fully necessary. We could also just like play queen c6 check. And there's actually, again, a mate here, which would have been nice. Instead, long castles was played. And the problem with this is that we lose the bishop as white on f4. So DisguisedToast ended up taking that bishop. G takes f4, knight takes f2, going for the attack on both rooks, trying to win the exchange here. Of course, again, the biggest problem for black is that their king is extremely weak. And a move like bishop takes a6 should actually end the game. But this was not played. Queen d7 check was played instead. And now there's a problem. All of a sudden, after king takes b8, well, if we look at the material here, we can see queen versus queen. Okay, that's equal. We see 2 bishops and a rook. They have 1 bishop and 2 rooks, but knight takes h1 or knight takes d1 is about to happen. Let's just say they defend their h1 rook. And queen b7 should probably be played just to defend the king. But let's just play the material game for a moment. Now when we look at it, we can see that Toast is actually now up a full bishop. And things have changed dramatically. Black should be winning this. So king to b6 was played instead. And the problem with this is, well, the king doesn't really belong there. And, you know, it could have taken the knight on b8 now that the bishop on f4 is no longer there. And this just makes the king a little bit weaker. So queen d8 check would have actually been essentially mate, because after king b7, the king cannot move up. After king b7 or king a7, king b7 is bishop takes a6 here. The knight is actually defending that square. And the king cannot take now that the queen is defending the knight. So instead we see queen c7 check, but this is also a mistake because now the king can take the queen and Toast is completely winning this one now. Rook to d2, queen takes b8, offering the rook in the corner, or not taking the rook in the corner. Both make sense here. I think you really have to watch out for this rook. But rook d2 is played, queen takes b8, and rook takes f2. But when we look at the final amount of material on the board, there's a rook for a rook, there's a bishop for a bishop, and then they have a rook versus a bishop and queen. And generally, a rook versus queen is winning, so a rook versus bishop and queen is even more winning for Toast here. Now we see f6, rook to g2, queen to b6, b4, a5, b takes a5, and maybe trying to hold on a little bit longer as a move like a3. But of course, this position is very, very winning, so it's hard to criticize or anything. These are just like suggestions of ways that I'd personally consider playing. B takes a5, and now, of course, the king can get hunted here with moves like queen b1, queen c2. Queen takes a5 was played instead. Also a very good move because, well, just recapturing the pawn. Bishop a3 check is also coming anyways. Rook b2. Queen takes c3 check. Looks very strong. The rook can't really move. And if we move to c2, there's a checkmate. And if we move out of the way, we can't move to b1 because this bishop on f5 is very strong. And if king d1, then queen takes b2, we'd lose the full rook. So king d1 was played. Queen takes b2. Bishop to b5, queen to b1 check, and this is very, very strong move as well because this is actually just winning the rook on h1. Queen takes h1, and again, bishop versus bishop. Generally what you do in chess is you just count what material's on the board, and generally you want to try to keep your material and take your opponents because, of course, since black has a ton of pieces on the board, what they can do is organize their pieces and deliver checkmate. So bishop versus bishop, of course, black is up a queen, bishop, and a rook here. So we see a4, queen takes on h2, king d1, and an easy way to deliver mate here is something we call the ladder mate, which is rook g8, threatening rook g1 check. And since the queen covers this rank and the rook would cover this one, the king can't move, and that would be checkmate. Instead, queen h1 was played. King to d2, rook to g8, king to c3 here, rook to g2, a5, queen c1 check, king b3, queen b1 check, king to a4, and finally we see rook to a2 with checkmate. This was a very, very interesting game. There were some there was a very promising opening from both sides. They played extremely well. This b5 was a bit of a problem, and so was g3. Ultimately, what led to the game being decided was just the material balance and giving up the queen by accident with the move queen c7 Not maybe I'm not sure exactly, but it might have been because they missed that the bishop was no longer on f4 defending c7. But that's only speculation. Anyways, let's go on to the last round. And here we have the final round, which is Ludwig versus Conor. Let's get into it. We see e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. So this is the classical king pawn opening, and the Scotch, which is very surprising. Now we see the move d6 played, and what white should probably do is just push, close the center up, and force this knight to a really awkward square, like b8 or e7, and start really trying to take advantage of this huge center. Instead, a3 was played, which isn't really an amazing move, because what we want to do is we want to try to control the center and improve our pieces in order to control those squares. I think the move a3 had the idea of actually just controlling b4, preventing knight b4 if a push were to occur. So I'm going to give them some credit here and aim that this was, or say that this was a what we call a prophylactic move, preventing something before it occurs. So bishop g4 was played, and now the move bishop to e2. And unfortunately, this actually loses a pawn. What should happen is takes, and knight takes d4. This is a very important pawn for white. Losing a central pawn like this could mean the end of the game. At the top level, this is like a resignation. Here, of course, game should go on. It's just a pawn. But okay, e takes d4 was played instead. But now this allows knight takes d4. Bishop takes e2 was played, and knight takes e2. So both sides are playing really, really well so far. Very minimal mistakes. Knight to f6, knight bc3. So knight f6, again, a high-level move, attacking the e4 pawn and developing a piece. Knight bc3, also very good, just developing a piece and defending the center. Now we see the move d5, and d5 is a bit of a problem because the piece, or the pawn, can just be taken. After e takes d5, this knight also has to move somewhere really uncomfortable. White can castle, and the position is winning for white. Of course, like winning at this level, maybe not, but an objective analysis would be that this is winning, right? So bishop to g5 was played instead, missing that the e takes d5 was a really strong move. Now we see d takes e4, knight takes e4, which is actually a mistake here, because after knight takes e4, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, Conor found it, knight takes e4. This is actually just an undefended knight on e4, and black is winning now. This is a full piece. Bishop to h4 was played, maintaining as much material as Ludwig could. Bishop to c5, castles, castles, and of course, again, because it's a full piece, this should be winning. b4 was played, bishop to e7, offering an exchange. The exchange was accepted by Ludwig. Knight takes e7, rook to d7, rook f to e8, rook takes c7. So Ludwig's actually, yeah, this is really great. They're going for a lot of activity, and this is generally what you should do when you're down material. Try to get some active pieces, take as many pawns as you can, make it messy. That's the best chance to switch the game around. Now we see b5, preventing the b pawn from being taken. Rook to e1, knight to d5, and this attacks the rook, so we have to watch out for that. Knight to d7 was played, and then knight back to f6. Arguably, maybe this move, this other knight back to f6 would have been challenging, because, well, where's the rook going? It's kind of really awkward here. e7's covered, d8's covered by the rooks. You can't go to c7 because of this knight, and everything's extremely well defended. You have to go somewhere really awkward, like b7 or d6. Instead, knight to f6 was played, totally winning anyways. Rook to d4, rook a to d8, and then c3. So there's actually a really cool combination here that I have to show it. It's my obligation as a chess player. Knight takes c3 is possible, which is really cool. And the idea is if you take the knight, then unfortunately what happens is rook takes e1 with checkmate. And if you instead try to throw in rook takes d8, thinking, oh, I'm smart because if takes, then now we can take on c3 and it's equal. Well, that's actually not the case. What we can do here is we can take on e2 first. And, well, actually, there's not really a good way to deal with this. After king to f1, we just take on d8 now, and we're up a full knight. So this just maintains everything and just forces a bunch of exchanges, which is exactly what black would want. Instead, rook takes d4 was played, which is a great move as well. Knight takes d4. Now we see knight to d2, which is cool because this is offering more exchanges. This shows a very, very high level of understanding here from Conor. Rook takes e8 was played. Knight takes e8. Knight to c6. b5 was hanging, but it wasn't taken. So knight c6 was played instead. But now a6. Knight to b8. Knight to c7 to defend a6. And this really cements that, yeah, Conor's going to win this. f4 was played. f5, g3, knight e4. Going for the c-pawn. King g2. Knight takes c3. Again, super high level play. Like, this is actually a really good game. h4, king f7, knight c6, knight to e2, knight to e5 check, king e6, king h3, king to f6, knight to d7. Just kind of going through the moves here a bit quicker. Knight to e5, knight to d5, bringing in the other piece to potentially attack. h5, and then knight e takes f4. Another very high level move, because what Conor's doing here is taking on f4, giving back one of their knights, but they're going to be winning the e5 knight in return, and they actually win 2 pawns out of it. So after g takes f4, knight takes f4 check, well, there's no way to defend the white king and move the knight at the same time. And even if you could, this would win a lot of pawns and would still probably be winning, even if giving back the piece. But of course, instead, knight d5 was played here. But after king takes e5, which was a better move, this game's over. But knight d5 was played instead. And this is actually still totally winning because, well, the knight's attacked and knight c3, b1's coming. So are moves like g6 and, well, there's going to be 2 passed pawns here. Like, let's just say knight f3. We see a move like g6 here. There's two passed pawns. I totally believe that Conor would win this one. So yeah, this was a great way to end off all of the chess. Very great. I don't know what else to say. There's not really many other words to use. Fabulous, extraordinary, sure, okay, whatever. But yeah, this was a great game by Conor, and that was a great way to end off the night. I keep using the word great. I'm so sorry. Anyways, that is going to cover it for all of the chess games. And that's the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching if you made it this far, or maybe you just skipped to the end and you wanted to just see the end of the video. Why would you do that? But again, thank you to Ludwig. Huge shout out to Ludwig for organizing this event. And shout out to all of the players who were ranging from masters to total beginners to the game. It takes a lot to go on a stage and, well, get punched in the face and play chess, and yeah, that's amazing. It's really cool. That's all I have really to say about the event. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Check out Ludwig's channel. Of course, Ludwig's like 10 trillion times bigger than me. Like, if there's one person that goes to Ludwig, then this video was worth it for checking out that boxing match. And that's going to cover it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you around. Bye-bye.